So hello everybody and welcome to this Alliance interview with Professor Alan Miller that we're delighted to bring you as part of a new week-long event that we're holding at the Alliance, the Digital Gathering. I'm Lucy Mulvagh, the Alliance's Director for Policy and Communication. Now, Professor Miller is a highly regarded member of the human rights community, both here in Scotland and internationally. Amongst his many roles, Alan was the first chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and he's currently Professor of Practice in Human Rights at the University of Strathclyde. And one of his other current important roles is as the independent co-chair of the National Taskforce for Human Rights Leadership, charged with developing a human rights framework for Scotland. So welcome, Alan, and many thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks, Lucy. Thanks for the invitation. And through you, thanks to the Alliance for your consistent advocacy over the years. So we've been on this journey together for a while, and we might be getting to a big line quite soon, I hope.
I hope so too, and we'll come on and talk about that and hear more about what work the task force has been doing. And actually on that note, so, you know, the National Task Force, for anybody who's watching this that doesn't know, it's really been spearheading a big programme of work to cement international human rights law into Scots law. Now, we've had many questions submitted by Alliance members on this, Alan, but I just wondered if you could start us off with maybe a bit of scene setting and tell us about the work of the National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again, Lucy. Well, I think in Scotland we've reached a moment in time when we're on the cusp of the biggest ever step that Scotland has taken on its human rights journey. The context for the task force being established by the government and principally by the First Minister was a number of things. Devolution had been in place for 20 years, so it was time to take stock. What have we achieved? What remains to be achieved? How should that be done? But it was given real impetus by Brexit, referendum 2016, because the arrangements under devolution, we had two real kind of pillars giving constitutional protection to human rights. One was membership of the EU and the rights that flew from that. And the other was the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. So Brexit removed the first, no longer in the EU with that protection. And because of that, it imperils the Human Rights Act, as we're currently seeing. So something had to be done to fill the vacuum. And then COVID, I think, has been a huge factor. You know, the task force was set up before COVID. We were just starting our public participatory process in the early part of this year when it was blown apart by COVID. So we have had to adjust and do a pretty extensive public engagement, but all online inevitably. But boy, you know, we have really experienced the increase in ambition across all walks of life in Scotland, that because we've suffered so much and learned so much the hard way about what needs to change, that there is a real determination that we have to be more ambitious than even we had been before. So economic, social, environmental rights, front and center. There's no more debate about the necessity for them. More effectively addressing structural inequalities. You know, the poor have suffered in so many ways disproportionately. The groups that we already knew beforehand, we had to ensure weren't left out of this new framework. No more debate about that either. So women, children, disabled, older people, LGBTI communities, they all have to ensure that they have equal enjoyment to all of the rights. So the approach that we've taken is a combination of being thoroughly internationalist, being maximalist, and multi-institutional. And by what very quickly I mean by that is internationalist is to bring for the first time in Scotland's history the internationally recognized rights that belong to us all and put them into the one place and enable full enjoyment of them. And then secondly, maximalist, to do within the limitations of the devolutionary arrangements, do everything that can be done to promote and protect human rights. and multi-institutionalists to share that leadership across not just government or the courts, but Parliament, all public bodies, and civil society as well. So finally, I mean, the framework is going to be, as I say, the biggest step, in my view, that Scotland has ever taken in human rights. But it's the first step in the sense that it will give effect and give rise to subsequent laws, policies, practices, and be the framework in which all decisions are made going forward. And so that's the opportunity for civil society to seize the moment and make sure that they are on the front foot in the effective implementation of this framework.
So we'll come on to talk a wee bit in a wee bit about kind of next steps and the opportunity for that there will still exist for people to get involved again, as you say, in getting this into statute and into practice. But if I can come back to this, you'd mentioned COVID-19 there, and we did have a number of members of the Alliance sending in questions in relation to COVID-19, particularly the situation in care homes during the pandemic, and in particular the restrictions on visiting and actually on residents being able to just get out to get some fresh air or whatever. Now, one of our members sent in an interesting proposition whether it's time now in Scotland for emergency human rights legislation, as has been mooted in Canada in the More Than Just a Visitor Act, which recognises the value of informal care in formal care settings. In your opinion, is this or some other action possible? Can it be taken to recognise and reinstate the rights of those in care homes and their families?
Well, I mean, I think, Lucy, there can hardly be a family in the country that hasn't got some personal experience of the agony of what's going on in care homes over the last year plus. But again, I think to all these families will recognise that a balance has had to be struck between visitation rights and family time together, with protection of public health and the duty to protect life of residents of care homes. So it's a tough one, and there will, of course, as we know, be not only a public inquiry, but a human rights-based public inquiry by the government to learn the lessons of all of this. And already we've seen, like the report from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, not only on care homes, but social care more generally, and what happened to so many of the social care packages because they were deprioritized as a result of the need to respond to the pandemic. And we've seen the independent review of adult social care. So you can see there's a growing recognition that a human rights-based approach to social care, including in care homes, its time has come. As far as the Taskforce is concerned, our mandate is to make recommendations for the future framework of human rights in Scotland. So not to propose any specific piece of legislation in any particular area, no matter how compelling that clearly is. So what we are doing, learning from COVID directly, just a couple of examples would be, we're actively considering the inclusion of rights within the framework, particularly rights of older persons, that they become more visible in decision making. They become more participative in decision making, which affects them, to be able to enjoy a life of dignity and of independence. And we're also actively considering the incorporation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which would introduce a social model of disability rather than the medical one we have now. So that in its very nature would strengthen the participation rights of residents in care homes, and would help further develop a human rights culture so that would improve the daily decision-making and the individual decision-making about family visitation rights, and not sort of blanket-wide policies, which have had to be considered in the emergency that clearly there was. But more scrutiny will be brought as a result of the framework, the care inspectorate and others. There will be more accountability. There'll be more involvement of families and individuals in making these balanced decisions. And all of that, I think, will be assisted by lessons learned from COVID. And then ultimately, access to justice, where human rights have been not respected or protected in either in care home visitation settings or anywhere else, that there must be easier access to remedies for that. Not only going to courts if need be, but short of that, by being able to use those rights introduced by the framework to simply say, this is my situation, these are my rights, these are the family rights. Let's have a discussion about how best to balance these rights in this new context of a new framework being introduced to Scotland.
Mm-hmm. And we have had a few questions come in from Alliance members about particular population groups, including disabled people. I'll come on to maybe those in a minute. But in the meantime, one of the other big contextual settings that you mentioned there in your introductory remarks was Brexit, of course, the new Brexit world that we're living in. What difference, if any, do you think being in Brexit or post-Brexit Britain actually makes to the incorporation work, and what difference in turn will incorporation make for that contextual setting in Scotland?
Yeah, I think Brexit in 2016, the referendum gave a real impetus. As I said earlier, we were sort of at the point of 20 years down the road of devolution. What are the next steps? But that really gave, as I say, a renewed impetus that the steps really did need to be taken in this new context. And there were three kind of guiding principles that we developed at that time. One was, what steps can be taken by Scotland to mitigate the risk of regression of the rights that had been enjoyed whilst being in the EU? How could Scotland keep pace with future progressive developments in the EU and Europe more generally? And how could we demonstrate leadership? What steps in and by Scotland needed to be taken? And I suppose we looked at it from the point of view, okay, Brexit has created a vacuum in our human rights framework. The two pillars we'd relied upon, EU membership, was gone. The Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights were therefore left more vulnerable. So could we introduce something into this vacuum that would have been the next steps anyway on Scotland's devolutionary journey? And therefore, what would these steps have been anyway? And how could we introduce them in this post-Brexit scenario? So that was, really presented an opportunity to consider, well, what kind of new framework should fill this vacuum, and how can these three principles, be given effect? So one was to consider that in this new framework, it should build upon and reaffirm the Human Rights Act and the rights provided by the European Convention, but should go beyond that, and Scotland should take the initiative and bring into our law those rights recognised from the UN human rights treaties that have been ratified by the UK, but not given domestic effect. So economic, social, cultural, environmental, and a whole set of group rights, equality rights. So that could be done both sort of to try and minimise the risk of regression, but opening a path forward. And then the second principle, how do we keep pace with European and international developments? I think one of the things we're looking at the Taskforce is, with this new framework, what's the merits of having a duty placed on the Scottish Government to have periodic implementation plans? How are we going to, in Scotland, give further effect to the rights in the framework and keep pace with developments in the EU, in the Council of Europe, or in the UN human rights system? So keeping it fresh and also contributing to it and demonstrating leadership. So, for example, we're looking at, as I said, should we include specific rights of older people? Now, the UN is giving thought to that being the next treaty, a convention on the rights of older persons. So we brought in the UN independent experts on the rights of older persons who's part of this process, and had a round table with her and representatives of older people in Scotland to say, how can we learn from international experience? How can we contribute to it and help shape an international convention by the steps we take in Scotland? And that was very much welcomed. And the same with the right to a healthy environment. The UN is increasingly being called on by civil society to enshrine the right to a healthy environment. Many countries have, and we're actively considering recommending that Scotland should do this. So again, contribute to international developments. Again, going back to COVID, recognizing its interference with the environment that had caused the pandemic in the first place. And if we don't, to borrow the Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, if we don't make peace with the environment now, then we're just going to see even worse pandemics in the future. So Brexit undoubtedly has been a big factor in this process underway in Scotland.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned opportunities to look at treaties that are related to specific population groups, and one of them that's potentially very well known to Alliance members and partners is, of course, the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. And we did have a number of questions submitted by Alliance members referring to or relating to population groups who would maybe be considered to come within the purview of that treaty. And I'm talking about, for example, people affected by mental health issues, autistic people, and people with learning or intellectual disability. And basically, Alliance members really kind of want to know what difference would incorporating a treaty like the CRPD make in terms of their lives, their right to choose, their right to live their lives the way they want to live, particularly in the context at the moment where some of the legislation that we have in place at the moment, for example, in mental health legislation, maybe doesn't actually achieve the same standards that one would potentially see under international human rights law. What are your thoughts about that?
I think, it's up to the government what they do, and it's up to the Taskforce still to decide what its recommendations are. And we're at the business end of that, literally over the next few days and weeks. And then the government will respond as to what steps it thinks it's going to take. But, if CRPD were to be incorporated, all the evidence that we have learned from the public engagement, from rights holders and civil society, those with lived experience themselves, from international experience, is that it would strengthen the rights of individuals, it would strengthen accountability, it would provide increased redress, and it would create a much more coherent and coordinated framework for all of these different rights and duties to be implemented. I think if CRPD were to be incorporated, the evidence that we've received is that it would be more outcome focused and not just process like has been the case under the Equality Act with sort of impact assessments. If we do this, would it harm this particular group? So the CRPD is a much more outcome forward looking approach towards it. And also within the framework, the First Minister's Advisory Group, which preceded the task force, said that there should not just be a duty to pay due regard to rights, but to comply. So it strengthens this more outcomes focused approach towards the rights of disabled people. But it all depends too, I think, more largely on what approach would be taken to incorporation of CRPD, were that what the government decided to do. That the starting point, what we've learned is to give effect to the CRPD and not try and fit it in to a system as best as can be done to sort of maintain the system, which you can understand. But the approach towards incorporation is that you start with what is the intent of this convention? Why has it been found to be necessary by the world to introduce, to enhance the lives of disabled people? So one of the big things that distinguishes the CRPD from, say, even the European framework or much of the domestic framework in the UK is it takes a social model and not a medical model. And its intent is to remove the social barriers, the social constructs, which prevent disabled people from the lives that they are capable of leading. So it will increase the participation of disabled people in the decisions that affect them. And whilst there is, good steps being taken in Scotland, it's not holistic enough. It's not coordinated enough. And this would, incorporation would lead to a much more coherent and coordinated framework. The current mental health law review that's underway, I think would benefit from sort of aligning with that approach of CRPD incorporation. And I know it's been taken very seriously by them. But also recognize that incorporation is the first step. It's like an overnight panacea. It's a big, but first step. And the duty under putting it into law would then be to take steps using the maximum available resources to progressively realize these rights to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So it's like a process of continuous improvement to attain and enabling and ensuring that nothing for us without us, which was the driving force with the CRPD. And I know from working internationally, that was a colossal civil society, global effort, unprecedented, which has left its mark. And it has to be that momentum that is garnered in Scotland for the participation of disabled people and disabled people's organisations to ensure that the maximum benefit of the incorporation of CRPD, if that's what the government decides to do, is achieved. So I think it would be extremely significant, but it's, as I say, a huge, big first step towards improving the lives of disabled people.
Mm-hmm. And for those population groups for whom there isn't perhaps a kind of UN tailored treaty. So, for example, we had a question in from one member related to the rights and the situation of people affected by or experiencing addiction. Presumably, if there isn't a group-specific treaty for population groups like that, there are other treaties that cover them. For example, the Convention on, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So there will be specific laws or recommendations for laws and specific action that will target those population groups as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, as I said before, the framework giving effect to internationally recognized human rights will be very, very important and a huge first step. And it's, I think the important thing to get is it's not limited to protected characteristics. It's broader in scope than that. It's not prescribed that these are the exclusive categories who will be given specific attention and acknowledgement. It's fundamentally based on the human dignity of everyone and the human potential of everyone and the right to fulfill that potential and therefore the obligation on a government and public bodies to take steps using the maximum available resources to attain the highest standards of physical and mental health for everyone. So much more broad in its scope, much more proactive in its nature than the Equality Act that we have in the UK and the protected characteristics and the sort of process-driven duties that exist there. And it will further develop a human rights culture and embed a human rights-based approach which ensures non-discrimination, that prioritizes the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, and you don't have to fit into a prescribed category. So someone suffering from an addiction has the same right to live lives of dignity and reach the highest attainable standard and address the sources of that addiction, which can be multiple. It can be stemming from all kinds of different factors, and the determinants for someone suffering from an addiction, whether it's drugs or alcohol, whatever, can often be found in the lack of other economic and social rights, not decent housing, not decent access to food, not decent conditions at work, not an adequate standard of living. So it's very much a much more holistic approach to understanding the underlying determinants of addiction, the respect for the right of that person to effectively address that and be given the appropriate support so as to realize their human potential, whether or not they are in a protected characteristic of the Equality Act.
Mm-hmm. So the work of the task force has been ongoing, somewhat obviously interrupted as much work has been by the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you see now are some of the biggest potential challenges ahead in work to incorporate human rights into Scots law?
Well, I think there are a number of challenges. The aim of introducing anything new in the field of human rights, particularly a big step like this, is to further develop a human rights culture so that you don't really need to the same extent laws or duties to get you to do the right thing, that it just becomes how things are done. It becomes the default. So it's the further development of a human rights culture that permeates, this daily decisions made about care packages or family visitations in care homes. So that's always the challenge in any country at any stage of its development, is getting it into the culture and the day-to-day practice. Having said that, I think we have made under devolution big steps in developing that culture. We wouldn't be talking here about being on the cusp of a big step like this had not a lot of work been done to bring us here to that realization. And so I don't understate the efforts made by all kinds of different people to bring us to where we've got to. But I think another big challenge inevitably will be, particularly post-COVID, the limited resources that are going to be available. That is a reality. And when you talk to, as we do, local authorities and health boards and other bodies who, they know they're going to be up against it for some considerable time. And I think there, again, it's important to have a sort of broader perspective. Scotland, despite the impact of COVID on future resources, is a relatively well-developed, well-off country compared with so many others around the world. And it really is a question of priorities, using the maximum available resources to ensure that minimum standards of quality of life and enjoyment of rights are met, and that there is a plan to progressively realize these rights as resources increase and continued improvement can take place. And I think more than anything, or as much as anything, certainly, the participation of affected people in these decisions about how resources are going to be allocated. I've no doubt you've had the same experiences as I've had, but you get more cost-effective benefits from involving people who can tell you, this is what we need, this would make the biggest difference. And it doesn't need some huge amount that is decided somewhere else would be best for us. That would be very nice, but empower us to make the best use of what resources are available and give us confidence that we're a priority and there's a plan to make things better as much as they can be made better in years to come and for our children. And for example, when I was chair of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, and before Judith sort of picked up and further developed to work with colleagues in the Scottish Human Rights Commission, the Leith Housing Project was, is the classic example of that, and where, led by the tenants, they identified actually quite small things, but big things in everyday life that would improve the quality, and then, having some kind of plan. This is the further steps we're going to take and the resources that can be applied to continuously improving our living conditions. And so when you found, unsurprisingly, when you improve the housing conditions, you improve health, you improve mental and physical health and well-being, a sense of community cohesion. So participation of people, me telling the Alliance about participation of people is a bit rich, but anyway, it's the task force recognises that, and that's very much part of our thinking just now.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting that you do raise that issue of concerns about resources. It's something that certainly that we and that I hear occasionally is that, grown, human rights, it's yet another thing we have to do, another model, another system, and it's going to be too expensive. And I wonder, I have heard some people say in response to that, well, can we afford not to? I mean, have we costed what not doing anything would take? And is that the most efficient and effective use of resources? And that's, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that might be what you're saying as well.
I think it is. That's the scale of, on a community basis like Leith, or it's the scale on a national basis where you need to take priorities. Where are we going to allocate the resources? Who are the most marginalized and vulnerable that we have to ensure are not left behind? But it's also, like human rights is international, and thoroughly international approach has to be taken. And you just have to look at the world today. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was brought in not as a kind of fair weather friend, that when things are good, let's do human rights. It came in when things were hardly be much worse. We'd had a Holocaust, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and that led to the realization we have to set standards, set a bar, and human rights is the foundation of us then trying to attain these standards. And you look around the world just now, when that foundation is challenged, for example, in the United States, as we've seen in the last few years, you see what happens to the society when you begin to unpick the foundations that have been laid by, a respect for human rights and for the cohesion of a society. And that now is why the UN is saying this is the biggest global crisis since the UDHR. And once again, human rights, particularly now economic, social equality, have to be front and center of the recovery. And again, you look, the Trump goes out, Biden comes in, and it's flicking a switch. The US will re-engage in the international rules-based order. Today it's announcing we will rejoin the UN Human Rights Council. We will rejoin the Paris Agreement because climate change is the existential threat to all human rights. We will rejoin the WHO. And more broadly, we can see vaccine nationalism. If you don't take a multilateral human rights-based approach towards the pandemic globally, no matter what we do in Scotland or the UK, the pandemic is not going to be effectively addressed. There'll be variants develop as we're now seeing. So human rights are not fair weather, not an extra, not an option at any level, from global to national to local level. And that I think is the confidence and the internationalist approach that you've seen develop in Scotland, which has brought us to where we are now. And as I say, hopefully on the cusp of our biggest step ever in reinforcing human rights in the way in which we govern ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So as a country, we're well placed in a post-pandemic as we come out of COVID-19. using that as an opportunity to further embed and progress with this work. It's already, as you said, is the culmination of years of work that have come before as well, not just here but internationally. What are some of the other big opportunities and levers ahead for work in the incorporation agenda? I might want to touch here on the public participation process and also the Taskforce's own report, which we know is due out soon.
Yeah, we're very much at the business end of the Taskforce. The report will come out next month in March. So I think the big opportunities, which certainly the Taskforce is alive to, is that, okay, we can make recommendations about this right or that treaty or this duty or that duty, and strengthening the human rights framework in Scotland, but it will only be as good as it's effectively implemented and reaches those who need it the most. And the guarantor of that is public participation. I think in two senses. One is directly related to the preparation of the framework after we've made our report and the government decides what it's going to do, and there will be a next stage towards introducing a bill to the Parliament after the election. A public participatory process as part of that preparation of the legislation is critical. I think for the public to lay claim to the framework, this is ours. We're taking our ownership and shared leadership in ensuring that it's effectively implemented, and here's how it has to be effectively implemented. Here are the levers and mechanisms and means to an end that have to be put into place. And then I think, once it is in place, there has to be ongoing public participation in how it actually works, how it operates. So that I think means, lots, but a step change in how people are able to know what their rights are and be able to know how they exercise their rights in their individual daily life. So, access to independent advocacy is increasingly is one thing. But then more broadly, there should be multiple points of entry that the public have to the operation of the framework. For example, we're thinking if the Scottish Government were placed under a duty to have a sort of framework implementation plan, how are we going to progressively realise these rights that we've now brought into our framework? A national action plan, like Scotland's national action plan and its next iteration, could be a very important part of giving effect to these rights. And SNAP 1 certainly was a very collaborative process. And if that feature can be maintained, then it's a means of public participation in not just SNAP, but that being a key part of the government's overall implementation plan for delivering the framework. And then maybe a more local level, if public authorities are placed under a duty to have the same sort of framework implementation plans, what are we going to do proactively, positively to give effect to these rights? The right of participation in shaping those plans also is another very, very important point of entry for the public. So public participatory process, public participation, at the end of the day, that's the guarantor whether it stands or falls and achieves its potential.
Well, we'll, of course, for everybody watching this, keep your eyes peeled on the Alliance website. We'll definitely be publishing the Taskforce's report when that comes out ere long, and we'll definitely be keeping our members and partners up to date on opportunities to further engage and inform and influence this work, whether through the participatory process or, all being well, through the legislative process. When we end up with a draft bill that's going through Parliament during the next parliamentary term, fingers crossed. I completely admit my bias in this whole debate, as anybody who knows me will know. Well, listen, Alan, can't thank you enough. We know you're incredibly busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today. Yeah, and just thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lucy, and it's great to hear the Alliance, commitment to further engage with this process and maximise its benefits for everyone. So look forward to seeing that. Yeah, good luck.
Thank you.